They lowered her into the ground at high noon while the desert sun blazed merciless overhead, turning the red dirt cemetery into a furnace that baked the mourners' skin and their consciences equally raw. Nobody moved to help the newborn baby, screaming beside the freshly dug grave, wrapped in nothing but a torn flour sack and the shame of a town that had already decided she didn't belong to any of them. The sound of moccasins on hardpan made every head turn toward the cemetery gate, where Chenoa Blackfeather stood motionless as carved stone, her dark eyes taking in the scene with the calculating patience of a predator, deciding whether these people were worth saving from their own cowardice. The town of Copper Ridge had gathered in their Sunday best, despite the Tuesday burial. Black wool and starched cotton wilting under the August heat that turned the small frontier cemetery into a testament to human endurance and divine indifference. Reverend Marcus Thornfield stood over the pine coffin with his leather-bound Bible clutched against his chest like armor, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of a man who had buried too many young women in his 15 years serving this harsh corner of the New Mexico territory. Mary Catherine Wells had been 19 years old when the fever took her 3 days after childbirth, leaving behind a baby girl with no father's name written in any church record, and no family willing to claim responsibility for either the child or the scandal that had preceded her brief, tragic life. The girl had worked in the hotel laundry, kept to herself, attended Sunday services with the desperate devotion of someone seeking forgiveness for sins the community had already decided were unforgivable. She died whispering prayers in a language that sounded like Spanish mixed with something older, something that made the women attending her deathbed cross themselves and step back from the bed. Now she lay 6 feet deep in desert earth while her unnamed daughter writhed in the merciless sun, her tiny fists beating against air thick enough to choke on. The baby's cries had started as soft mewling sounds when Reverend Thornfield began reading from Ecclesiastes, but they had grown stronger and more desperate as the service dragged on, as if the child understood she was being buried alongside her mother in everything but body. Mayor Samuel Whitman shifted his considerable weight from boot to boot, mopping sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief already soaked through with nervous perspiration. His wife Eleanor clutched her fan like a weapon, snapping it open and closed in rhythm with her mounting irritation. Dr. Jeremiah Hayes stood apart from the main group of mourners, his medical bag at his feet and his conscience warring with his professional oath. He had delivered the baby 4 days ago in Mary Catherine's cramped room above the hotel kitchen, working by lamplight while the girl hemorrhaged and begged him to promise the child would be raised Christian and safe. The doctor had made that promise while pulling a healthy baby from a dying mother. But now he watched the community he served prepare to abandon both promise and child with the cold calculation of people who had learned to survive by cutting away anything that might drag them down. The baby's wails grew more frantic as the sun climbed higher, her small body arching against the rough fabric that barely covered her. Sweat beaded on tiny arms and legs that had never known anything but struggle. First fighting to be born into a world that didn't want her, now fighting to be heard by people who had already decided she was invisible. Mrs. Agnes Porter, who ran the town's only boarding house and considered herself the unofficial keeper of community morals, pursed her lips and whispered loud enough for half the gathering to hear that some burdens were too heavy for decent folks to bear. That charity had limits, and that the Lord helped those who helped themselves. 27 adults stood in that baking cemetery, and not one of them reached for the crying child. They formed a rough circle around the gravesite, but it was a circle of exclusion rather than protection, a boundary that kept them safely separate from the consequences of Mary Catherine's choices and their own failures of compassion. The blacksmith, Thomas Reed, wiped his massive hands on pants already stained with honest sweat and honest work, but his eyes remained fixed on the ground rather than the baby, whose future lay as uncertain as smoke in desert wind. Sarah Mitchell, who taught school to 12 children in a one-room building that doubled as a church when the weather turned bad, had spent the previous night lying awake and calculating the cost of taking in an orphan on a teacher's salary that barely covered her own needs. She had convinced herself by dawn that someone else would step forward, someone better suited to raise a child whose mother had died unmarried and unrepentant. The teacher's rationalization felt solid in the pre-dawn darkness, but under the blazing sun, with the baby's cries cutting through the hot air like accusation, her certainty crumbled like autumn leaves. Frank Morrison, who owned the general store that served as the town's commercial heart and gossip center, calculated the social cost of association with Mary Catherine's child, the same way he calculated profit margins on flour and sugar. His wife had already made her position clear over breakfast. They had 3 children of their own to feed and educate, and taking on another mouth would strain resources that were already stretched thin by drought and fluctuating cattle prices. The store owner nodded along with his wife's reasoning, while privately wondering, what kind of man let a baby cry herself hoarse, rather, than risk the disapproval of neighbors who would forget their judgment within a month? The baby's cries began to change as dehydration and exhaustion took their toll, becoming weaker but more desperate, like an animal caught in a trap that was slowly tightening. Her tiny fingers, which had been clenched into fists, began to relax as her strength faded. The temperature had climbed past 100 degrees, and the flour sack that served as her only protection was already soaked with sweat, and providing no relief from the sun that beat down like divine punishment on the just and unjust alike. Deputy Sheriff Jake Coleman stood with his hand resting on his gun belt, not from any sense of threat, but from the nervous habit of a man who had learned that authority meant making hard choices and living with their consequences. He had been the one to find Mary Catherine's body when the hotel owner reported she hadn't been seen for 2 days. The deputy had also been the one to discover that the girl had hidden what little money she possessed in a coffee tin under loose floorboards, along with a letter addressed to whoever might find her daughter if something happened to her mother. The letter had been brief and written in the careful script of someone who had received more education than her circumstances suggested. Please find my baby a good home far from here. She is innocent of whatever sins you think I committed. Her name should be something beautiful, because she came from love, even if you don't believe that. I've saved $7 for her care. It isn't much, but it is everything I had. Coleman had folded the letter and put it in his shirt pocket, where it remained as the baby cried and the community debated her fate through silence and inaction. The first sign that someone was approaching came not from sound, but from the sudden stillness of the desert creatures that had been watching the human drama unfold from the safety of sagebrush and creosote. Lizards that had been sunning themselves on hot stones disappeared into shadows. A red-tailed hawk that had been circling overhead suddenly wheeled away toward the mountains. Even the persistent buzz of flies around the horses tied to the cemetery fence seemed to quiet, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Chenoa Blackfeather appeared at the cemetery gate like a mirage, solidifying into reality. But there was nothing insubstantial about her presence. She stood nearly 6 feet tall in moccasins that had covered more ground than most of the townspeople would travel in their lifetimes. Her black hair was braided with hawk feathers and small silver ornaments that caught the sunlight and threw it back in sharp flashes that made it difficult to look directly at her face. She wore buckskin leggings and a tunic decorated with geometric patterns in red and yellow beadwork that spoke of artistic skill and cultural pride that Copper Ridge had never bothered to understand. The Comanche woman's arrival sent a ripple of tension through the funeral gathering that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with fear, prejudice, and guilty knowledge of wrongs that had never been acknowledged or addressed. Most of the townspeople had heard stories about Chenoa Blackfeather, though few had seen her face to face. She was said to track better than any man in 3 territories, to speak 5 languages fluently, and to have once walked 200 miles through Apache country to deliver medicine to a Mexican family whose children were dying of smallpox. But the stories that made the people of Copper Ridge nervous were darker ones. How Chenoa had confronted a group of buffalo hunters who were slaughtering pregnant cows and leaving the meat to rot, and how 3 of those hunters were found dead the next morning with Comanche arrows in their hearts. How she had appeared at a trading post where a white merchant was selling watered whiskey to reservation Indians, and how that merchant had disappeared on his way back to Santa Fe, leaving behind only a burned wagon and horses that wandered home riderless. The territorial authorities had investigated both incidents, but found no evidence linking Chenoa to either death, though everyone understood that absence of evidence was not the same as proof of innocence. Now she stood at the edge of their cemetery like judgment personified, her dark eyes moving from face to face with the methodical thoroughness of someone cataloguing sins for future reference. She made no threatening moves, spoke no words, but her presence transformed the funeral gathering into something that felt more like a trial, where everyone was simultaneously judge, jury, and defendant. The baby's cries seemed to grow louder in the silence that followed Chenoa's arrival, as if the child recognized that something fundamental had shifted in the balance of power around her. Mayor Whitman cleared his throat and stepped forward with the self-important swagger of a man who had never learned the difference between authority and bullying. He had been elected to his position by promising to keep Copper Ridge safe from the various threats that plagued frontier settlements. Rustlers, claimed jumpers, hostile Indians, and anyone else who might disrupt the orderly progress of civilization as the townspeople understood it. Facing down a Comanche woman who might or might not be a killer represented exactly the kind of leadership moment he had imagined when campaigning for office. "This is a private ceremony," Whitman announced in his best official voice, the one he used for town council meetings and 4th of July speeches. "We're burying one of our own, and we'd appreciate being left to mourn in peace." His words carried across the hot air with less authority than he had intended, sounding more like a request than a demand. Several mourners shuffled their feet and looked anywhere except at the imposing figure by the gate. Chenoa Blackfeather said nothing in response to the mayor's pronouncement. She simply tilted her head slightly, like a hawk studying prey from a great height, and continued her visual inventory of the people who had gathered to bury a young woman while abandoning her child to death by exposure. Her silence was more unsettling than any verbal response could have been, because it suggested that she was seeing through their public mourning to the private calculations that had brought them to this moment of moral failure. The baby's cries were becoming weaker, reduced to hoarse gasps that spoke of a small body pushed beyond its limits by heat, thirst, and the stress of being unwanted in a world that had already proven itself hostile to her existence. Dr. Hayes found himself torn between his medical training, which demanded he provide immediate care to any child in distress, and his social position in a community that survived by maintaining strict boundaries between acceptable and unacceptable behavior. Reverend Thornfield clutched his Bible tighter and tried to summon the righteous authority that had served him well in 15 years of frontier ministry. He had baptized Mary Catherine Wells when she first arrived in Copper Ridge 2 years ago, a young woman with no family connections and a story about traveling west to work as a seamstress that didn't quite explain how she had acquired the calloused hands of someone accustomed to harder labor. The Reverend had accepted her into his congregation because Christian charity demanded it. But he had also maintained the social distance that protected his reputation when that charity proved insufficient. "We have no quarrel with you," Thornfield called out to Chenoa, his voice carrying the measured tones he used for Sunday sermons and deathbed comforts. "This is a matter for our community to resolve according to our customs and laws. The child will be cared for according to Christian principles and territorial statutes governing orphaned children." His words sounded reasonable and lawful, but they rang hollow in the desert air because everyone present knew that no one had stepped forward to provide that care. And territorial orphanages were filled with children who had learned that legal protection was not the same as actual safety. Chenoa's response was to take 3 steps forward, bringing her inside the cemetery gates and close enough that the funeral gathering could see the controlled power in her movements and the intelligence in her eyes that missed nothing and forgave less. She wore no visible weapons, but everyone present understood that a woman who had survived alone in Comanche territory for over 30 years had access to methods of violence that went far beyond guns and knives. Her very presence was a weapon, wielded with the precision of someone who understood that sometimes the threat of action was more effective than action itself. The baby's breathing became more labored as the sun reached its peak intensity, turning the desert cemetery into a furnace that would have challenged healthy adults, let alone a newborn with no protection from the elements. Her tiny chest rose and fell with increasing effort, and the flour sack that had been wrapped around her was now completely soaked with sweat. Mrs. Porter fanned herself more vigorously and muttered that this was what came of associating with people who didn't understand proper Christian behavior, while carefully avoiding any direct acknowledgement of the child whose life was ebbing away in front of 27 people who had chosen witnessing over acting. Deputy Coleman felt the weight of Mary Catherine's letter in his pocket and the heavier weight of a badge that was supposed to represent protection for all citizens, regardless of their social status or the circumstances of their birth. He had taken an oath to serve and protect the people of Copper Ridge and the surrounding territory. But that oath had never specified whether it applied to inconvenient babies whose mothers had died without providing socially acceptable explanations for their children's existence. The standoff stretched longer as Chenoa continued her patient evaluation of the situation, taking note of each person's position, their body language, their weapons, and their apparent willingness to escalate the confrontation. She had faced down buffalo hunters, Apache raiders, Mexican bandits, and territorial officials who thought being white and male automatically gave them authority over anyone who was neither. This collection of sweating farmers, merchants, and minor officials represented a different kind of challenge. People who committed their cruelest acts through inaction rather than violence, who maintained their sense of righteousness by letting others suffer rather than taking direct responsibility for causing that suffering. The baby's cries finally stopped, not because her needs had been met, but because she no longer had the strength to voice her desperation. The silence that followed was more terrible than her crying had been, because it meant that a new life was surrendering to circumstances that 27 adults had the power to change, but lacked the will to address. Her tiny body lay still in the flour sack, chest barely rising and falling, skin flushed with heat stroke and dehydration that would soon progress to organ failure if immediate intervention didn't occur. Dr. Hayes broke first, his medical training finally overriding his social caution. He grabbed his bag and started toward the baby, but Mayor Whitman caught his arm and held him back with a grip that was firm enough to bruise. "This isn't our responsibility, Jeremiah," the mayor hissed under his breath. "Mary Catherine made her choices and now we have to live with the consequences. Getting involved won't bring her back, and it sure won't solve the problem of what happens to that child long term." The doctor struggled briefly against Whitman's grip, then stopped when he realized that several other men in the funeral gathering were positioning themselves to support the mayor's decision through physical force, if necessary. Chenoa Blackfeather watched this exchange with the expression of someone who had suspected the worst about human nature and was now seeing those suspicions confirmed in the most brutal way possible. She began walking toward the center of the funeral gathering with the unhurried pace of a predator that had already decided how this encounter would end. Each step she took caused the mourners to shift and bunch together like sheep sensing a wolf, their funeral decorum cracking under pressure that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with the collision between their public values and private cowardice. "That's far enough," Deputy Coleman called out, his hand moving to his gun butt in a gesture that was more nervous reflex than tactical decision. "I'm ordering you to leave this cemetery immediately. You have no business here, and your presence is disturbing a lawful religious ceremony." His voice carried less conviction than his words suggested, because even he could see the moral contradiction between claiming to protect a religious ceremony that was allowing a baby to die and threatening someone who might actually provide the help that child needed. Chenoa stopped walking when she was still 10 feet away from the baby, close enough to see the child's labored breathing and flushed skin, but far enough away that no one could claim she was making threatening moves toward any of the mourners. When she finally spoke, her English was precise and unaccented, the product of education that most of the people facing her had never received, despite their assumptions about their cultural superiority. "I see 27 adults burying one person and killing another," she said, in a voice that carried clearly across the hot air without being raised. "I see people who call themselves Christians watching a baby die rather than risk their reputation by showing mercy. I see cowardice dressed up as respectability and cruelty disguised as proper behavior." Her words hit the funeral gathering like physical blows, because they articulated truths that everyone present had been working very hard not to acknowledge. The baby stirred weakly in her flour sack wrapping, making a sound that was barely audible, but somehow more heartbreaking than her earlier cries had been. It was the sound of someone giving up, of a life force that had been strong enough to survive birth and her mother's death, but was now succumbing to the indifference of people who had the power to save her, but lacked the courage to act. Chenoa looked around the circle of faces one more time, her gaze lingering on each person, long enough to make them understand that she was memorizing their features and their choices for future reference. Then she began walking toward the baby with the steady determination of someone who had made a decision that would not be altered by threats, social pressure, or the possibility of violence. Chenoa Blackfeather moved through the circle of mourners like water flowing around stones, her presence parting the crowd without a single person daring to physically block her path to the dying infant. Deputy Coleman's hand remained frozen on his gun butt as he watched her approach, his training warring with an instinctive understanding that drawing his weapon on a woman trying to save a baby would mark him as something worse than a coward in the eyes of anyone with a functioning conscience. The other mourners stepped back involuntarily, creating a widening circle around the baby, as if Chenoa carried some contagious disease that might infect them with her willingness to act when action was desperately needed. When Chenoa reached the baby, she knelt beside the tiny form with movements that were both graceful and efficient, her experienced hands immediately assessing the child's condition with the skill of someone who had delivered babies in circumstances far more challenging than a civilized cemetery. The infant's skin was flushed and dry, her breathing shallow and rapid, her small body limp with the kind of heat exhaustion that could kill a healthy adult, let alone a newborn who had never known anything but struggle. Chenoa unwrapped the flour sack with careful precision, revealing a perfectly formed baby girl whose only crime was being born to a mother who had died before explaining her choices to a community that demanded explanations for everything that deviated from their narrow definition of acceptable behavior. "She needs water immediately and shelter from this sun, or she'll be dead within the hour," Chenoa announced to the assembled mourners, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen enough death to recognize its approach with absolute certainty. She looked up at Dr. Hayes, who was still being restrained by Mayor Whitman's grip on his arm. "You're a doctor. You took an oath to preserve life. Are you going to honor that oath, or are you going to let your neighbors turn you into an accessory to infanticide because it's socially convenient?" Her words cut through the hot air like a blade, forcing Hayes to confront the choice he had been trying to avoid since the funeral began. Dr. Hayes jerked his arm free from the mayor's grip with a suddenness that surprised everyone present, including himself. The medical bag that had been sitting unused at his feet suddenly became the most important object in the desert as he rushed toward Chenoa and the baby, his professional training finally overriding the social pressure that had kept him paralyzed. From his bag, he produced a small bottle of clean water and a piece of soft cloth, which Chenoa immediately used to begin cooling the baby's overheated body while carefully dripping water between her parched lips. The transformation in the baby's condition was almost immediate as cool water touched her dehydrated system, and the improvised shade provided by Dr. Hayes's body blocked the merciless sun from continuing its assault on her tiny frame. Her breathing became less labored, her color began to improve, and after several minutes of careful hydration, she opened her eyes for the first time since the funeral began. Those eyes were dark and alert, taking in the faces around her with the kind of focused intelligence that suggested she would remember this moment for the rest of her life. Regardless of how long or short that life might prove to be, Mayor Whitman watched this medical intervention with the expression of a man who realized he had just lost control of a situation that was supposed to be simple and straightforward. A funeral should have been followed by burial, followed by the community moving on from an unfortunate episode that had complicated their lives for too long. Instead, he was watching a Comanche woman and the town doctor working together to save a baby that no one wanted to claim, while 25 other citizens stood around looking like extras in a morality play that was heading toward a conclusion none of them would find comfortable. Sarah Mitchell, the schoolteacher who had convinced herself that someone else would step forward to help the baby, found her carefully constructed rationalization crumbling as she watched Chenoa's calm competence in the face of the community's moral failure. During her sleepless night before the funeral, Sarah had told herself that taking in an orphan would be financially impossible on her teacher's salary. But watching the baby respond to basic care made her realize that her calculations had been based more on social fear than economic reality. She had been afraid of being associated with Mary Catherine's scandal, afraid of the whispers and judgments that would follow anyone who showed mercy to a child whose mother had died, unmarried and unrepentant. But Sarah Mitchell had secrets of her own that made her fear of judgment particularly acute. Secrets that connected her to Mary Catherine Wells in ways that no one in Copper Ridge suspected. 3 years earlier, when Sarah had first arrived to take the teaching position, she had been fleeing her own scandal in a Kansas town where she had fallen in love with a married man whose wife had discovered their affair. Sarah had changed her name from Sally to Sarah, altered her age by 2 years, and created a fictitious background that explained her education and experience while concealing the circumstances that had forced her to abandon everything she had known and loved. The irony of her situation was not lost on her as she watched Chenoa carefully cleaning the baby's face with Dr. Hayes's medical supplies. Sarah Mitchell had built her new life in Copper Ridge by being the most respectable, most morally upright member of the community, teaching children proper behavior and Christian values while carefully hiding her own past mistakes. She had been harder on Mary Catherine than anyone else, precisely because the young woman's visible pregnancy reminded Sarah of her own capacity for choices that violated community standards. Now she was watching a Comanche woman show more Christian charity than the entire congregation that had gathered to bury Mary Catherine while abandoning her child. Thomas Reed, the blacksmith whose massive hands had shaped iron for every building in Copper Ridge but had refused to reach out to help a dying baby, found himself remembering a conversation he had overheard 3 months earlier between Mary Catherine and his wife, Martha. The two women had been standing outside the general store, and Martha had been offering advice about preparing for childbirth, the kind of practical guidance that experienced mothers shared with younger women facing their first delivery. But Thomas had heard Mary Catherine ask a question that had puzzled him at the time. What do you do when the baby's father can't be there for the birth? But you know he'd want to be if circumstances were different. Martha Reed had assumed Mary Catherine was talking about a husband who worked far from home, or a fiancé who was traveling on business. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The kind of temporary separation that frontier families often endured for economic reasons. But Thomas remembered the particular sadness in Mary Catherine's voice, a tone that suggested permanent separation rather than temporary absence. He had dismissed the conversation as women's business that didn't concern him. But now, watching Chenoa work to save Mary Catherine's daughter, he wondered if the young woman had been trying to tell someone about circumstances that were more complicated than simple abandonment by an irresponsible lover. Frank Morrison, the general store owner who had calculated the social cost of helping Mary Catherine's baby the same way he figured profit margins, suddenly found himself remembering details about the young woman's shopping habits that had seemed insignificant at the time but now took on different meaning. Mary Catherine had always paid in cash, never credit, and she had always purchased supplies in quantities that suggested she was feeding more than one person. She bought coffee in amounts that seemed excessive for a single woman, tobacco that she clearly didn't smoke herself, and soap that was better quality than someone in her economic circumstances would normally choose for personal use. More significantly, Mary Catherine had regularly purchased items that made no sense for a hotel laundry worker: leather conditioner, gun oil, ammunition for rifles that she didn't own, and dried meat in quantities that suggested she was providing supplies for someone who spent long periods away from town. Morrison had assumed she was buying these items for hotel guests or running errands for other people. But the pattern now suggested she had been supporting someone whose presence in Copper Ridge would have been controversial. Someone who couldn't purchase supplies openly without creating the kind of attention that would have been dangerous for both of them. Eleanor Whitman, the mayor's wife, who had been snapping her fan in irritation throughout the funeral, suddenly recognized Chenoa Blackfeather as someone she had encountered before, though the circumstances of that previous meeting were not something she had ever discussed with her husband or anyone else in Copper Ridge. 5 years earlier, Eleanor had been traveling alone to visit her sister in Santa Fe when her stagecoach had broken down in the middle of Apache territory during a particularly dangerous period when several white families had been killed in raids along the territorial roads. Eleanor had been abandoned by the stage driver and guard, who had taken the other passengers and the strongest horses to continue their journey, leaving her with promises that help would be sent back for her and her disabled coach. She had waited for 2 days in the desert heat with no water, no food, and no realistic hope of survival when Chenoa Blackfeather had appeared like a desert mirage, leading a pack horse loaded with supplies and showing no surprise at finding a white woman stranded in the middle of nowhere. Chenoa had repaired the coach wheel with tools and skills that Eleanor had never seen a woman demonstrate, provided food and water, and guided Eleanor safely to the next way station without asking for payment or explanation. During the day-long journey to safety, Eleanor had learned that Chenoa spoke perfect English, had been educated by missionaries as a child, and possessed knowledge of medicine, mechanics, and survival that surpassed most men Eleanor had known. She had also learned that Chenoa moved freely between white and Comanche communities, serving as an unofficial mediator, translator, and problem solver for disputes that the territorial authorities either couldn't or wouldn't address. But most importantly, Eleanor had learned that Chenoa's reputation as a dangerous killer was deliberately cultivated to protect her ability to travel alone through territory, where a woman without fearsome reputation would not survive long. Eleanor had never told her husband about this encounter because it would have raised too many questions about why she had been traveling alone to Santa Fe. Questions that would have led to discoveries about gambling debts she had accumulated and family money she had borrowed without permission to pay those debts. Her trip to Santa Fe had been an attempt to negotiate with creditors who were threatening to expose her financial problems to the Copper Ridge community. Problems that would have destroyed her husband's political career and their social standing. Genoa had saved Eleanor's life, but Eleanor had repaid that debt with silence about Genoa's true character, allowing the dangerous reputation to persist because correcting it might have revealed embarrassing truths about her own circumstances. Now, watching Genoa work to save Mary Catherine's baby while 26 other adults stood around doing nothing, Eleanor felt the weight of her 5-year-old debt and her ongoing cowardice crushing down on her like desert heat. She knew that Genoa Blackfeather was not the savage killer that Copper Ridge believed her to be, but speaking up would require explanations that Eleanor was still not prepared to provide. The mayor's wife found herself caught between her knowledge of Genoa's true character and her need to protect secrets that had shaped her marriage and her husband's career for half a decade. Deputy Coleman, meanwhile, was experiencing his own moment of recognition as he realized that Genoa Blackfeather was the woman who had prevented what could have been a massacre 18 months earlier when a group of drunk cowboys had decided to teach some lessons to a family of Mexican sheepherders who had grazed their flock too close to water that the cowboys considered their exclusive territory. Coleman had arrived at the scene expecting to find bodies and had instead discovered 5 unconscious cowboys, their weapons missing, and a Mexican family that refused to explain what had happened, except to say that an angel with dark skin had appeared and made the bad men go to sleep. The deputy had never filed a complete report about that incident because the cowboys were too embarrassed to admit they had been disarmed and disabled by a single woman, and the Mexican family was too frightened of retribution to provide details that might have implicated their rescuer. Coleman had suspected that Genoa was involved, but he had also understood that pursuing the matter would likely result in dead cowboys and a situation that would spiral out of control faster than territorial law enforcement could handle. He had chosen to let sleeping dogs lie, but now he was watching those same capable hands that had disarmed 5 armed men working gently to save a baby's life. Under Genoa's care and Dr. Hayes's medical supervision, the baby, who had been dying of heat exhaustion and dehydration, began to show remarkable resilience and strength that surprised everyone present, including the doctor who had delivered her 4 days earlier. Her color returned to normal. Her breathing became steady and strong, and she began to move her arms and legs with the vigorous energy of a healthy newborn, rather than the listless weakness of someone surrendering to death. Most remarkably, she seemed to respond specifically to Genoa's voice, turning her head toward the Comanche woman whenever she spoke, and calming immediately when Genoa's hands touched her. Dr. Hayes found himself professionally fascinated by the baby's rapid recovery and her apparent bond with her rescuer. But he was also troubled by implications that went far beyond medical curiosity. During his years practicing frontier medicine, he had delivered dozens of babies and had learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated mixed heritage in children whose parentage might be complicated or controversial. This baby's features, her skin tone, the shape of her eyes and the texture of her hair all suggested that her father might not have been the white drifter or traveling salesman that the community had assumed. The possibility that Mary Catherine's child was part Comanche would explain several mysteries that had puzzled Dr. Hayes during the young woman's pregnancy. Her unusual knowledge of herbal remedies for morning sickness, her complete lack of fear when Comanche raiding parties had been spotted in the area, and her insistence on preparing for childbirth using traditional methods that she claimed her grandmother had taught her. Hayes had assumed Mary Catherine was referring to a Mexican or Spanish grandmother, but watching the baby's response to Genoa made him wonder if the grandmother in question might have been Comanche, And if Mary Catherine's connection to that heritage was more direct and recent than anyone had suspected, Chenoa herself seemed unsurprised by the baby's rapid recovery or her responsiveness to Comanche handling and language. But she also made no comments that might confirm or deny the questions that were beginning to form in several observers' minds. Instead, she focused on the immediate practical needs of an infant who required ongoing care, nutrition, and protection from environmental hazards that could easily kill someone so small and vulnerable. She began fashioning a more effective shade structure using her own clothing and Dr. Hayes's medical bag, creating a micro-environment where the baby could continue to recover without being subjected to the desert conditions that had nearly killed her. As the baby's condition stabilized, her personality began to emerge in ways that captivated even the mourners, who had been prepared to let her die rather than complicate their lives with unwanted responsibility. She was alert and curious, tracking faces and voices with unusual focus for someone so young. She seemed particularly drawn to sounds and movements that suggested strength and competence rather than weakness or uncertainty. When Mayor Whitman approached to get a closer look at the child his community had nearly abandoned, she turned away from him dismissively, but when Thomas Reed stepped forward, she reached toward his calloused hands with obvious interest in their evidence of useful work. The baby's discriminating responses to different people created an uncomfortable dynamic among the funeral gathering, as it became clear that she was somehow evaluating the adults around her and finding most of them wanting her strongest positive response remained directed toward Chenoa, but she also seemed drawn to Dr. Hayes, Deputy Coleman, and surprisingly to Sarah Mitchell, whose guilt about her own past mistakes had motivated her to step closer and offer whatever assistance she could provide. The baby's ability to sense character and respond accordingly was both remarkable and deeply unsettling to people who were accustomed to being judged by their social status rather than their actual moral worth. The transformation in the cemetery atmosphere was palpable as the baby's recovery progressed, and her personality emerged. What had begun as a funeral for one person and the abandonment of another had become something more complex and morally challenging. A confrontation between the community's stated values and their actual behavior when those values required personal sacrifice or social risk. Chenoa Blackfeather had not only saved a baby's life, but had also forced 27 adults to confront the gap between what they claimed to believe and how they actually behaved when their beliefs were tested by circumstances that demanded courage rather than just compliance with social expectations. Father Miguel Hernandez had been standing silently at the edge of the funeral gathering, his weathered hands clasped behind his back and his dark eyes taking in details that the other mourners had missed in their focus on the dramatic confrontation between Chenoa and their community's moral failures. As the oldest resident of Copper Ridge, having arrived with the original Spanish land grants 40 years before American territorial law had imposed itself on this corner of New Mexico, Father Miguel possessed institutional memory that stretched back to times when the boundaries between cultures were more fluid and less violently enforced than they had become under territorial administration. The priest had recognized Mary Catherine Wells the moment she arrived in Copper Ridge 2 years earlier, though he had honored her obvious desire for anonymity by never speaking publicly about her true identity or the circumstances that had brought her so far from her original home. The young woman calling herself Mary Catherine Wells had actually been born Maria Esperanza Vasquez in a small village near the Mexican border, the daughter of a Mexican mother and a Comanche father who had fought alongside Quanah Parker in the last great campaigns against American expansion into traditional hunting grounds. Maria's father, known among the Comanche as Runs Like Wolf and among Mexican traders as Roberto Vasquez, had been killed during a cavalry raid when she was 12 years old, leaving her mother to raise a daughter whose mixed heritage made her unwelcome in both the Mexican settlements that feared Comanche blood and the Comanche bands that distrusted Mexican influence. Her mother had died of consumption when Maria was 16, leaving her with no family connections and skills in languages, medicine, and survival that marked her as someone who belonged fully to neither world, but had learned to navigate both. Father Miguel had known Maria's mother, Elena, when she had been a young woman working as a translator and negotiator between Mexican ranchers and Comanche bands who were trying to establish peaceful trading relationships in the years before the American territorial government had made such arrangements illegal. Elena had fallen in love with Roberto during one of these trading negotiations, and their marriage had been blessed by Father Miguel himself in a ceremony that combined Catholic ritual with Comanche spiritual practices in ways that would have scandalized the current residents of Copper Ridge, but had seemed natural and appropriate in the more tolerant atmosphere of pre-territorial New Mexico. The priest had watched Maria grow from a bright, curious child into a young woman whose intelligence and courage were matched by her tragic understanding that the world was changing in ways that would leave no place for people like her, people whose very existence challenged the rigid racial and cultural boundaries that American law was imposing on territory that had once belonged to neither Mexico nor the United States, but to indigenous peoples who had inhabited this land for centuries before European colonization had begun the long, violent process of displacement and cultural destruction. When Maria had arrived in Copper Ridge calling herself Mary Catherine Wells and claiming to be an orphan from Kansas seeking work as a seamstress, Father Miguel had recognized her immediately, but had also understood that she was trying to create a new identity that would allow her to survive in a world that had become increasingly hostile to mixed-race people who could not be easily classified according to American territorial law. He had respected her choice by maintaining her secret, but he had also watched over her with the protective concern of someone who had known her since childhood. As Chenoa continued caring for the baby with the practiced efficiency of someone who had extensive experience with infant care, Father Miguel began to recognize familial similarities that explained her immediate bond with the child and her willingness to risk confrontation with an entire community to save one small life. The shape of the baby's hands, the set of her eyes, the particular way she held her head when listening to unfamiliar voices all suggested genetic connections that went beyond the general similarities that might exist between any Comanche woman and any child of mixed indigenous heritage. Father Miguel approached Chenoa slowly, speaking in Spanish rather than English to signal his understanding that this conversation required privacy and cultural sensitivity that the other mourners would not possess or respect. "Buenos dias, prima," he said quietly, using the Spanish word for female cousin that could indicate either actual family relationship or close friendship between families. "I remember when your brother Roberto married Elena Vasquez 28 years ago. You stood as witness at their wedding ceremony, along with Elena's sister Carmen and Roberto's war chief, whose name I was told not to speak in the presence of outsiders." Chenoa looked up from the baby with eyes that confirmed Father Miguel's recognition, while also warning him to be careful about what information he shared in the presence of people whose cultural understanding was limited and whose political loyalties might be dangerous to her safety or the child's future. "Sí, padre," she replied in Spanish that was fluent, but carried the slight accent of someone who had learned the language as a second tongue rather than growing up with it as her primary means of communication. "I have been watching over Maria since her mother died. I knew she was with child, and I knew the father." The priest nodded slowly, understanding that Chenoa's admission contained layers of meaning that would require careful exploration if he was going to help protect both the baby and her guardian from the political and social consequences of their true relationship. "The father," is Comanche," he said in Spanish, making it a statement rather than a question. "Someone from your band. Someone whose presence here would create difficulties for everyone involved." Chenoa's expression confirmed his supposition, while also indicating that the identity of the baby's father was information that would not be shared casually, even with a priest who had known the family for decades. "Maria came to me 6 months ago," Chenoa continued in Spanish, her voice low, enough that the English-speaking mourners could not overhear her words, even if they had been able to understand the language. She was frightened and alone, carrying a child whose father had been killed during a cavalry patrol that was supposed to be conducting peaceful negotiations with our tribal council. She asked me to promise that if anything happened to her, I would make sure her daughter was raised with knowledge of both sides of her heritage, Mexican and Comanche, so that she would not grow up believing she belonged nowhere. Father Miguel felt the familiar weight of secrets that connected past, violence to present consequences, secrets that he had been carrying for decades as the unofficial keeper of community memory in a region where official records often omitted crucial details about the human cost of territorial expansion and cultural conflict. The cavalry patrol that Chenoa was referring to had been reported in territorial newspapers as a successful peacekeeping mission that had resulted in the voluntary surrender of several Comanche warriors who had agreed to relocate to reservation lands in exchange for safe passage for their families. But Father Miguel had heard different versions of that story from Mexican ranchers who had witnessed the actual events. Versions that described an ambush of Comanche negotiators who had arrived under a flag of truce, expecting to participate in good faith discussions about land use and trading rights. The warriors, who had supposedly surrendered voluntarily, had actually been killed while trying to protect their families from cavalry forces that had never intended to honor the negotiation agreements that had brought the Comanche representatives to what they thought would be a peaceful meeting. The baby's father, Chenoa, revealed to Father Miguel in their continued Spanish conversation, had been a young warrior named Standing Bear who had served as one of the primary translators and cultural mediators for his band's attempts to negotiate peaceful coexistence with American territorial authorities. Standing Bear had been chosen for this role because of his exceptional intelligence, his fluency in Spanish and English, and his diplomatic skills that had made him effective at finding common ground between cultures that seemed increasingly incompatible as territorial law became more rigid and exclusionary. Standing Bear had met Maria during one of these negotiation sessions when she had been working as a translator for Mexican ranchers who were trying to establish grazing agreements that would allow their cattle to use traditional Comanche hunting grounds during certain seasons without violating territorial law or triggering military retaliation. Their relationship had begun as a professional collaboration between two people whose linguistic and cultural skills made them valuable intermediaries in complex political situations. But it had developed into something deeper as they recognized in each other the particular loneliness that came from belonging fully to neither of the worlds they moved between. Their romance had been conducted in secret, not because they were ashamed of their feelings for each other, but because they understood that their relationship would be viewed as politically dangerous by authorities on both sides of the cultural divide that territorial law was working to enforce. Mexican ranchers would see Maria's involvement with a Comanche warrior as evidence that she could not be trusted to represent their interests faithfully, while American territorial officials would view Standing Bear's relationship with a woman of Mexican heritage as proof that he was not sufficiently committed to the reservation system that was designed to separate indigenous peoples from ongoing contact with civilian populations. The secrecy that had protected their relationship during its development had also isolated them when crisis struck and Standing Bear was killed during what was officially described as a routine patrol. but was actually a deliberate ambush designed to eliminate Comanche, leaders who possessed the knowledge and skills necessary to continue, resisting territorial authority through diplomatic rather than military means. Maria had been pregnant when Standing Bear died, but she had been unable to claim widow's benefits or community support because their marriage had been conducted according to Comanche custom rather than territorial law, making it legally invisible to American authorities. Father Miguel absorbed this information with the grim understanding of someone who had spent decades watching territorial law systematically destroy relationships, families, and communities that had managed to find ways of coexisting peacefully across cultural boundaries that American administration insisted on treating as absolute and unbridgeable. The baby that Chenoa was now caring for represented not just one more tragic consequence of territorial expansion, but also the potential continuation of cultural knowledge and family connections that official policy was designed to eliminate. The priest realized that Mary Catherine's death and the community's abandonment of her child represented a moment of choice that would determine whether the cultural bridge building that had been represented by her parents' generation would survive into the future, or whether the forces of separation and cultural destruction would succeed in severing the connections that had once allowed different peoples to find common ground in this harsh but beautiful landscape that had been home to all of them long before territorial boundaries had been imposed by distant authorities who understood neither the land nor the people, who had learned to live with it. Dr. Hayes, who had been listening carefully to the Spanish conversation between Chenoa and Father Miguel while continuing to monitor the baby's medical condition, possessed enough linguistic knowledge to understand the general outline of what was being discussed, though many of the cultural and political nuances were beyond his comprehension. What he had understood clearly was that this baby was not simply an abandoned orphan whose parentage was unknown, but rather a child whose family history was intimately connected to the violent conflicts that had shaped the recent history of the territory and continued to influence the political dynamics that governed daily life in communities like Copper Ridge. The doctor found himself facing professional and personal decisions that went far beyond the medical care that had initially motivated his intervention in the funeral ceremony. If the baby was the daughter of a Comanche warrior who had been killed during official military operations, then providing her with ongoing medical care might be viewed by territorial authorities as providing aid to enemies of the state, depending on how current political tensions developed and what official policies emerged from the territorial governor's office regarding mixed-race children who might maintain connections to indigenous communities. But Dr. Hayes had also taken an oath to preserve life regardless of political considerations, and his medical examination of the baby had revealed a healthy, intelligent child who deserved every opportunity to survive and thrive despite the circumstances that had brought her into the world. The doctor's professional training had taught him to evaluate patients based on their medical needs rather than their social or political status. But his experience practicing frontier medicine had also taught him that political considerations could easily override medical judgment when territorial authorities decided that public policy required sacrificing individual lives for broader governmental objectives. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Mayor Whitman had been watching the Spanish conversation between Chenoa and Father Miguel with growing anxiety, understanding that information was being shared that would complicate his ability to resolve this situation in ways that protected Copper Ridge from unwanted attention from territorial authorities. The mayor's political survival depended on maintaining his community's reputation as a law-abiding settlement that supported territorial policy and posed no threat to American expansion and development. But harboring the child of a Comanche warrior could easily be interpreted as providing sanctuary to enemies of the state. The mayor approached Father Miguel and demanded an English translation of the conversation that had been conducted in Spanish. But the priest declined to provide details that might endanger either the baby or her guardian, explaining only that the child's parentage was more complex than the community had assumed, and that her care would require sensitivity to cultural considerations that went beyond the simple matter of finding a family willing to adopt an orphan. Father Miguel's evasiveness frustrated Whitman, but also confirmed his suspicion that this situation was developing in directions that could threaten his political position if not handled carefully. Eleanor Whitman watched her husband's growing agitation with her own sense of mounting dread, understanding that the secrets she had kept about her previous encounter with Chenoa Blackfeather were becoming more dangerous as the current situation escalated beyond a simple matter of community charity toward something that might involve territorial law, enforcement, and official investigations into the political loyalties of Copper Ridge residents. If questions were raised about the community's relationship with Comanche individuals, Eleanor's previous rescue by Chenoa might be discovered, leading to inquiries about why she had been traveling alone to Santa Fe and what business had required such secrecy. Sarah Mitchell, meanwhile, found herself calculating different kinds of risk as she realized that the baby's mixed heritage and complex family history made her situation similar to Sarah's own experience of trying to create a new identity that would allow survival in a community that demanded conformity to narrow social expectations. The school teacher understood better than most of the other mourners what it meant to carry secrets that could destroy your social position if discovered, and she was beginning to see in this abandoned baby an opportunity for redemption that might allow her to atone for her own past mistakes while providing genuine help to someone who needed it desperately. The baby herself remained calm and alert throughout these adult discussions of her fate, continuing to respond most positively to Chenoa's voice and touch, but also showing interest in the faces and voices around her as if she were already learning to evaluate the character and intentions of the people who would determine her future. Her remarkable resilience and apparent intelligence were becoming increasingly obvious to everyone present, making it harder for anyone to dismiss her as simply an unwanted burden rather than a human being with intrinsic value and potential for contributing positively to whatever community accepted responsibility for raising her. The dust cloud on the eastern horizon appeared just as the cemetery gathering was beginning to process the implications of Father Miguel's revelations about the baby's true heritage and the political complications that her mixed Comanche and Mexican ancestry would create for anyone willing to provide her with long-term care. Deputy Coleman raised his hand to shade his eyes against the afternoon sun as he counted the approaching riders, his stomach dropping when he realized that 6 mounted men were heading toward Copper Ridge at the kind of deliberate pace that suggested official business rather than casual travel. Captain William Harrison of the Territorial Cavalry arrived at the cemetery with 5 armed soldiers, their blue uniforms dusty from hard riding, but their weapons clean and ready for immediate use. Harrison was a career military officer who had built his reputation on efficient suppression of indigenous resistance throughout New Mexico territory, and his presence in Copper Ridge represented the kind of official attention that Mayor Whitman had been desperately trying to avoid since Chenoa Blackfeather had first appeared at the funeral. "I received reports of Comanche activity in this area," Captain Harrison announced as he dismounted, his eyes immediately focusing on Chenoa, who remained kneeling beside the baby, with the calm alertness of someone who had expected this development and was prepared to deal with its consequences. Territorial law requires all citizens to report unauthorized indigenous presence to military authorities immediately. Mayor Whitman, explain why my office wasn't notified that a known Comanche operative was operating freely in your community. Mayor Whitman's face flushed red as he realized that someone in Copper Ridge had sent word to the territorial authorities about Chenoa's presence, though he had no way of knowing which resident had decided that their political safety required betraying a woman who had just saved a baby's life. The mayor's carefully constructed political position was collapsing as he found himself caught between his desire to maintain good relations with territorial authorities and his growing understanding that Chenoa had demonstrated more genuine Christian charity than anyone else in his community. Captain Harrison, we have the situation under control, Whitman began, but his words carried no conviction because everyone present could see that the situation was far beyond the control of local civilian authorities. This woman appeared during a funeral ceremony and provided medical assistance to an orphaned infant. We were just determining the appropriate legal procedures for handling the child's care when you arrived. The mayor's explanation was technically accurate, but omitted crucial details that would determine whether this encounter escalated into violence. Captain Harrison studied the scene with the tactical assessment skills that had kept him alive during 15 years of frontier military service. He saw a Comanche woman holding a baby, surrounded by nervous civilians who were clearly hiding information that he needed to complete his mission. He also saw Deputy Coleman's hand resting on his weapon, Dr. Hayes's protective positioning near the woman and child, and the general body language of a community that was deeply divided about how to respond to his arrival. Ma'am, I need you to step away from that child and place your hands where my soldiers can see them, Harrison ordered, directing his command to Chenoa in the tone he used for issuing orders to subordinates who were expected to comply immediately and without question. You're under suspicion of violating territorial laws regarding unauthorized indigenous movement and potential kidnapping of a white child. Compliance with my instructions will be noted favorably in my official report. Chenoa Blackfeather rose slowly from her position beside the baby, but instead of stepping away as Captain Harrison had ordered, she moved protectively between the child and the mounted soldiers, whose weapons were now drawn and pointed in her direction. Her movement was fluid and controlled, demonstrating the kind of physical confidence that suggested extensive combat training. But she made no aggressive gestures that could justify immediate use of force by the military personnel who were evaluating her every action for signs of threat or resistance. This child is my great-niece, Chenoa announced in English that was clear and precise enough to ensure that everyone present understood both her words and their implications. Her mother was Maria Esperanza Vasquez, daughter of my brother Roberto, who died fighting to protect his family from cavalry forces that violated treaty agreements. Her father was Standing Bear, a peace negotiator who was murdered during talks that your government promised would be conducted under sacred truce conditions. Captain Harrison's expression hardened as he recognized the names that Chenoa had spoken, names that appeared in military reports that he had filed himself 6 months earlier when his unit had participated in what official documents described as a successful pacification operation that had eliminated several key indigenous leaders who had been organizing resistance to reservation policies. The captain understood that this woman possessed detailed knowledge about military operations that were supposed to remain classified, and that her presence here represented a potential intelligence threat that went far beyond simple violation of movement restrictions. Those operations were conducted according to territorial law and military necessity, Harrison replied, his voice carrying the defensive edge of someone who had learned to justify actions that violated his personal moral code in service of broader policy objectives that he didn't question, because questioning them would make his job impossible to perform. Indigenous individuals who refused to comply with relocation orders forfeited their right to protection under territorial law. Any children born from unauthorized relationships are wards of the territorial government. Father Miguel stepped forward with the moral authority that his decades of service had earned him, positioning himself between Chenoa and the soldiers in a gesture that was both protective and symbolic. Captain Harrison, this child is baptized Christian and has been under the care of our community since her birth. She is not a ward of any government, but a member of our congregation who deserves protection rather than separation from her family. The priest's intervention carried weight because his position gave him official standing that even military authorities were required to respect. Dr. Hayes joined Father Miguel in creating a human barrier between the soldiers and Chenoa. His medical bag held prominently as a reminder that his professional obligations transcended political considerations. Captain, this infant requires ongoing medical care that can only be provided by someone with experience in treating mixed heritage children who may have specific health needs related to their genetic background. Separating her from her current caregiver could result in medical complications that would violate territorial policies regarding the welfare of children under governmental protection. The baby herself seemed to sense the tension that was building around her, beginning to cry with the sharp, distressed sounds that indicated she was responding to the emotional stress of the adults who were determining her fate. Her cries had an immediate effect on several of the civilians who were watching this confrontation, particularly the women who had been suppressing their maternal instincts throughout the funeral ceremony, but now found those instincts activated by the sound of an infant in distress. Sarah Mitchell made the first move toward open defiance of territorial authority by stepping forward to stand with Father Miguel and Dr. Hayes. Her decision motivated by recognition that this moment represented her opportunity to redeem herself for a lifetime of moral compromises and social cowardice. Captain Harrison, I am prepared to provide legal guardianship for this child under territorial statutes governing orphaned minors, she announced, her voice steady despite the enormous personal risk she was taking by openly opposing military authority. Thomas Reed, the blacksmith, whose massive frame and calloused hands represented the kind of honest labor that territorial authorities claimed to value, moved to join the group of civilians who were protecting Chenoa and the baby. His decision was motivated less by political considerations than by his growing shame at his earlier failure to help when help was desperately needed. This woman saved a baby that we were prepared to let die, Reed declared, his deep voice carrying across the cemetery like an anvil strike. Any government that punishes someone for showing mercy is a government that doesn't deserve our respect. Eleanor Whitman found herself facing the choice she had been dreading for 5 years, the choice between maintaining the secrets that protected her social position and acknowledging the debt she owed to the woman who had saved her life when no one else would have bothered. The mayor's wife stepped away from her husband and moved toward the group of civilians who were defying military authority, her action motivated by understanding that some debts could only be repaid through public acknowledgement, regardless of personal cost. Captain Harrison, Chenoa Blackfeather once saved my life when I was stranded in Apache territory, Eleanor announced, her voice carrying clearly across the cemetery, despite the trembling that betrayed her fear of the consequences her admission might bring. She asked for nothing in return, and she never revealed my presence in territory where I had no legal right to travel. She is not the savage that territorial policy claims all Comanche to be, but a woman of honor who has shown more Christian charity than most of the people who claim to serve Christ. Mayor Whitman watched his wife's public defiance with the stunned expression of a man who realized that his political career was ending in real time, that the careful balance he had maintained between local interests and territorial demands was collapsing under the weight of moral choices that could no longer be avoided or postponed. His wife's admission that she had been traveling illegally in Restricted territory would raise questions about his knowledge and complicity that would end his political effectiveness, even if he avoided criminal charges. Captain Harrison found himself facing a situation that his military training had not prepared him to handle. An entire civilian community that was choosing to protect an indigenous woman and mixed-race child, despite clear territorial law and explicit military authority. His orders were to apprehend Chenoa Blackfeather and secure any children who might be under unauthorized indigenous care. But executing those orders now would require using force against civilians who included a priest, a doctor, a teacher, and the wife of the local mayor. The captain's tactical assessment of the situation was complicated by his recognition that several of the civilians who were protecting Chenoa were armed and positioned in ways that suggested they were prepared to resist military force if necessary. Deputy Coleman's hand remained on his weapon, but his body language indicated that he was more likely to side with the civilians than with territorial authorities if violence erupted. Dr. Hayes was unarmed but positioned to shield the baby with his body if shooting started. Father Miguel's moral authority would make him a problematic target even for military personnel who were following lawful orders. The standoff reached its critical moment when one of Captain Harrison's soldiers, a young corporal named Jenkins, who had been growing increasingly nervous as he watched the civilian resistance organize, accidentally discharged his rifle while adjusting his grip on the weapon. The shot went harmlessly into the ground, but the sound of gunfire in the tense atmosphere of the cemetery caused immediate reactions from everyone present that brought the situation to the edge of open combat. Deputy Coleman drew his weapon reflexively, pointing it toward the soldiers rather than toward Chenoa, his action making clear that he considered the military personnel to be the primary threat to community safety. Thomas Reed grabbed a shovel from the graveside and held it like a weapon, his blacksmith's muscles making the tool look as dangerous as any sword. Several other civilians scattered toward cover behind tombstones, while others moved closer to form a protective circle around Chenoa and the baby. Captain Harrison realized that his mission had become impossible to complete without causing casualties that would create political problems far beyond his authority to resolve. Killing or wounding civilians who were protecting a baby would generate newspaper coverage and congressional inquiries that could end his military career and potentially result in policy changes that would undermine territorial authority throughout New Mexico. But allowing his authority to be openly defied by a group of civilians would set a precedent that could encourage resistance to territorial law in other communities. Chenoa Blackfeather used the moment of chaos following the accidental gunshot to demonstrate why she had earned her reputation as someone who should not be underestimated or cornered. Moving with speed that surprised everyone present, she retrieved a knife from her boot and held it in a position that was clearly defensive but unmistakably lethal, her stance indicating that she possessed fighting skills that would make her dangerous to anyone who attempted to take the baby from her by force. "Captain Harrison," Chenoa said in a voice that carried the authority of someone who had faced death many times and had learned not to fear it when protecting something more important than her own survival. "You have a choice to make. You can try to take this child from me, which will result in bloodshed that will bring more attention to your military operations than your superiors want. Or you can file a report saying that you found no evidence of unauthorized Comanche activity in Copper Ridge and return to your regular duties." The baby's cries intensified as the tension around her reached its peak, her distress sounds serving as a reminder that this confrontation was ultimately about the fate of an innocent child whose only crime was being born into a world where her mixed heritage made her existence politically inconvenient for authorities who preferred simple categories that could be easily managed through bureaucratic procedures. Captain Harrison looked around the cemetery at the faces of civilians who had transformed from nervous mourners into determined defenders of a principle that transcended their individual fears and self-interest. He saw people who were prepared to risk their lives, their livelihoods, and their social standing to protect a Comanche woman and a mixed-race baby because they had finally been forced to choose between following orders and following their consciences. The captain's military experience had taught him to recognize when a tactical situation had developed in ways that made victory impossible, regardless of superior firepower or legal authority. Continuing this confrontation would result in casualties, political complications, and the kind of moral defeat that would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. But backing down would represent a failure of military authority that could have consequences for territorial policy that extended far beyond this single incident in a small frontier town. Captain Harrison holstered his weapon with the deliberate precision of a career military officer who had learned that the most important battles were often won through strategic retreat rather than tactical advancement, his actions signaling to his soldiers that the confrontation in Copper Ridge Cemetery would not escalate to the bloodshed that everyone present had been anticipating with a mixture of dread and grim determination. The captain's 15 years of frontier military service had taught him to recognize when political objectives conflicted with practical realities in ways that made successful mission completion impossible regardless of superior firepower or legal authority. Corporal Jenkins, secure your weapon and prepare for immediate departure, Harrison ordered, his voice carrying the controlled authority of someone who was making a command decision that would require careful explanation to superiors who had not witnessed the circumstances that made compliance with original orders tactically inadvisable. This community is not harboring unauthorized indigenous activity, and there are no Comanche children requiring governmental intervention under territorial statutes governing mixed-race minors. The captain's official redefinition of the situation represented a masterful example of military bureaucratic flexibility that would allow all parties to avoid the political and personal consequences that would have resulted from a violent confrontation over the custody of a baby whose mixed heritage made her existence inconvenient for territorial authorities who preferred simple classifications that could be managed through established administrative procedures. By declaring that no unauthorized activity was occurring, Harrison was creating a legal fiction that would protect both his military career and the civilians who had been prepared to defy territorial authority. Dr. Hayes understood the implications of Captain Harrison's decision and moved quickly to formalize the arrangements that would provide legal protection for both the baby and her guardian under territorial law. Captain, I am filing official medical documentation that this infant requires specialized care that can only be provided by her current guardian, who possesses expertise in treating health conditions specific to children of mixed indigenous heritage, the doctor announced, pulling forms from his medical bag that would create bureaucratic justification for Chenoa's continued presence in Copper Ridge. Sarah Mitchell stepped forward with the legal guardianship papers she'd been preparing mentally throughout the confrontation, understanding that the success of Captain Harrison's strategic retreat would depend on the community's ability to create official documentation that would satisfy territorial administrative requirements while protecting the substance of what they were actually accomplishing. I am formally requesting appointment as legal guardian for this child under territorial statutes, with the understanding that her cultural education will be provided by qualified indigenous specialists who are operating under official community sanction. Father Miguel added his ecclesiastical authority to the legal arrangements by producing baptismal records that would provide additional protection under territorial law. which generally respected religious documentation even when political considerations might otherwise complicate a child's legal status. This child has been baptized into the Christian faith and is therefore entitled to protection under territorial statutes governing the welfare of Christian minors, regardless of the heritage of her biological parents, the priest declared. His words creating another layer of legal justification for the arrangements that were rapidly crystallizing around Skybringer's future. Chenoa Blackfeather watched these bureaucratic maneuvers with the amused understanding of someone who had learned that white people's laws were often more flexible than their rhetoric suggested, particularly when flexibility served the interests of officials who needed to avoid political complications that might threaten their careers. She had no illusions about the permanence of these arrangements or the genuine commitment of territorial authorities to protecting indigenous rights. But she also understood that temporary accommodations could sometimes be extended indefinitely if all parties maintained their commitment to avoiding unnecessary confrontations. The weeks following the cemetery confrontation brought changes to Copper Ridge that transformed the small frontier community in ways that would have been impossible to imagine before Chenoa Blackfeather had stepped forward to save a dying baby and forced 27 adults to confront the gap between their stated Christian values and their actual behavior when those values required personal sacrifice or social risk. Sarah Mitchell formally adopted Skybringer through territorial legal procedures, but the child's daily care was provided through a collaborative arrangement that included Chenoa, Dr. Hayes, and several other community members who had discovered that raising a child required skills and perspectives that no single person possessed. Thomas Reed used his blacksmith skills to construct a cradle that incorporated both European carpentry techniques and traditional Comanche design elements, creating a functional work of art that symbolized the cultural bridge building that Skybringer's existence represented for the community that had chosen to embrace rather than abandon her mixed heritage. The cradle's completion became a community celebration that brought together people who had previously maintained careful social distance from anyone whose background differed significantly from their own established patterns of acceptable association. Eleanor Whitman's public acknowledgement of her debt to Chenoa had initially threatened her husband's political career, but the mayor discovered that his wife's courage in speaking truth during a crisis had actually enhanced his standing with constituents who respected moral integrity more than they valued political expedience. The couple's marriage was strengthened by Eleanor's decision to end the secrecy that had separated her from her husband for 5 years. And Samuel Whitman found that governing a community was easier when it was based on honest communication rather than careful management of multiple conflicting deceptions. Dr. Hayes established a regular medical practice that served both the civilian population of Copper Ridge and the indigenous communities in the surrounding territory, becoming one of the few white medical professionals who was trusted by Comanche families to provide care for their children during illness or injury. His collaboration with Chenoa in developing treatment protocols that combined European medical knowledge with traditional indigenous healing practices created a medical approach that was more effective than either system would have been alone. Father Miguel's church became a meeting place where Spanish, English, and Comanche languages were all used during services that incorporated religious traditions from the three cultures that had learned to coexist in Copper Ridge despite the territorial government's official policies promoting cultural separation and indigenous elimination. The priest's Sunday sermons began including references to moral lessons that could be found in traditional stories from all three cultural backgrounds, creating a spiritual environment that reflected the actual diversity of his congregation, rather than the cultural uniformity that territorial authorities preferred. Deputy Coleman's law enforcement approach evolved to emphasize community problem-solving rather than strict adherence to territorial statutes that had been written by distant authorities who possessed no understanding of the practical challenges facing frontier communities, where survival often required flexibility and cooperation that transcended official racial and cultural boundaries. His jail was rarely occupied because disputes were increasingly resolved through mediation processes that drew on traditional indigenous approaches to conflict resolution. Frank Morrison's general store became an unofficial trading post where community members could exchange goods and services according to traditional indigenous principles of reciprocity rather than strict monetary transactions, creating an economic system that was more resilient and sustainable than the pure cash economy that territorial policy was designed to promote. His inventory expanded to include items that served the needs of all cultural groups in the community, and his understanding of value expanded to include social and spiritual considerations alongside financial profit. Skybringer's development during her first 2 years of life demonstrated the advantages of being raised within a community that had learned to value diversity rather than fear it. As she grew into a remarkably intelligent and adaptable child whose multilingual abilities and multicultural understanding positioned her to serve as a bridge between worlds that had previously been separated by mutual suspicion and institutionalized hostility. Her first words included vocabulary from Spanish, English, and Comanche languages, reflecting the linguistic environment that had been created around her by adults who understood that cultural knowledge was a form of wealth that should be shared rather than hoarded. Sarah Mitchell's classroom became a laboratory for educational approaches that combined European academic subjects with traditional indigenous knowledge about natural science, mathematics, and philosophy, creating a curriculum that prepared children to function effectively in the changing world they would inherit, while maintaining connections to the cultural wisdom that had enabled their families to survive in challenging environments for countless generations. Skybringer's presence in the classroom as she grew older encouraged other mixed-heritage children from surrounding communities to attend school in Copper Ridge, where they could receive education that honored all aspects of their identity. Chenoa Blackfeather established a permanent residence in Copper Ridge while maintaining her connections to traditional Comanche communities, creating a living bridge between worlds that enabled both cultural groups to benefit from knowledge and resources that had previously been available only to one side or the other. Her presence provided security for community members who traveled through territory that remained dangerous for people whose appearance or behavior marked them as culturally different, and her diplomatic skills helped resolve conflicts before they escalated to violence. Dr. Hayes documented Skybringer's remarkable physical and intellectual development in medical journals that were circulated among frontier physicians, providing scientific evidence that children of mixed heritage often demonstrated hybrid vigor that made them healthier and more intelligent than children from single ethnic backgrounds. His research contributed to growing understanding among medical professionals that racial mixing produced genetic advantages, rather than the degeneration that territorial policy claimed to be preventing through segregation. The child's education included traditional Comanche skills such as tracking, hunting, and survival techniques alongside European academic subjects and Mexican cultural traditions, creating a knowledge base that would allow her to function effectively in any environment she might encounter during her lifetime. Skybringer's teachers recognized that the world she would inherit would require people who could move fluidly between different cultural systems while maintaining their integrity and moral principles regardless of external pressures to conform to narrow expectations. Her presence in Copper Ridge attracted visitors from throughout the territory who wanted to observe a community that had successfully integrated different cultural groups without the violence and chaos that territorial authorities claimed was inevitable when racial boundaries were not strictly maintained. These visitors often arrived as skeptics, but left as converts to the practical advantages of cultural cooperation over cultural conflict, spreading word about Copper Ridge's success to other communities facing similar challenges. 20 years after the funeral that had changed everything, Skybringer had grown into a woman whose reputation as a peacemaker and cultural translator had made her one of the most respected figures in New Mexico territory, serving as an unofficial ambassador between indigenous communities and territorial authorities who had learned that negotiation with her was more effective than military confrontation in resolving disputes that had previously been settled only through violence. Her childhood experience of being rescued by community courage rather than abandoned to bureaucratic convenience had shaped her into someone who understood that real strength came from the willingness to protect those who could not protect themselves. Copper Ridge had become a model, a community that territorial authorities grudgingly acknowledged as proof that cultural integration could produce economic prosperity and social stability rather than the chaos and violence that had been predicted by policies designed to maintain racial separation. The town's population had grown to include families from dozens of different cultural backgrounds who had been attracted by its reputation as a place where people were judged by their character and contributions rather than by their ancestry or previous mistakes. Sarah Mitchell had become a renowned educator whose teaching methods were studied and replicated throughout the territory, demonstrating that children learned more effectively when their education honored their complete cultural heritage, rather than forcing them to choose between different aspects of their identity. Her adoption of Skybringer had evolved into a relationship that resembled partnership more than traditional parent-child dynamics, as both women had learned from each other in ways that had enriched their understanding of what family could mean when it was based on choice and commitment rather than just biological connection. The cemetery where Mary Catherine Wells was buried had become a pilgrimage site for people throughout the territory who wanted to pay respects to a young woman whose death had catalyzed social changes that had improved life for countless individuals who had previously been marginalized or excluded from community participation. Fresh flowers appeared on her grave regularly, placed there by people whose lives had been changed by the courage that her daughter's rescue had inspired in adults who had discovered their capacity for moral action when circumstances demanded it. Genoa Blackfeather had lived to see her great-niece become a woman whose influence extended far beyond the small frontier community where she had been saved from death by exposure. But the elderly Comanche woman's greatest satisfaction came from knowing that the promise she had made to her dying sister-in-law had been kept not just in letter, but in spirit. Skybringer had grown up knowing both sides of her heritage, proud of her mixed ancestry, and committed to using her unique position to build bridges between communities that still struggled with the legacy of historical conflicts and cultural misunderstandings. The baby who had almost died while 27 adults watched had become a woman whose life represented living proof that the courage to act according to moral principles rather than social convenience could transform not just individual lives but entire communities, creating ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate circumstances that had demanded a choice between compassion and conformity, between protecting the vulnerable and protecting oneself from criticism or inconvenience. Skybringer's story had become a legend that inspired people throughout the territory to examine their own moral choices and ask themselves what they would have done if they had been present at that desert cemetery on the day when one woman's courage had shown an entire community what they could become if they chose love over fear. 2 years after that blazing August afternoon in Copper Ridge Cemetery, Jake Coleman sat in a rocking chair on the porch of his small house overlooking the cemetery, his deputy sheriff badge still gleaming on his vest, but his approach to law enforcement forever changed by what he had witnessed during Skybringer's rescue. The former rigid lawman had become something of a local storyteller, sharing the account of that transformative day with visitors who came to Copper Ridge to learn about the community that had discovered its capacity for moral courage when circumstances demanded they choose between convenience and conscience. Coleman's telling of the story had already begun to take on the weight of legend, though the events were still fresh enough that most of the participants remained active members of the community and could correct any details that his memory might have embellished or softened. His perspective as someone who had initially been prepared to arrest Chenoa Blackfeather for saving a baby's life gave him unique credibility. When he spoke about the power of individual transformation and the possibility that entire communities could change direction when faced with clear moral choices. The visitors who sought out Coleman's account represented a growing network of frontier communities that were grappling with similar questions about how to balance territorial law with human decency, how to maintain social order while protecting the vulnerable, and how to build inclusive societies in regions where different cultural groups were being forced into closer contact than historical precedent had prepared them to navigate successfully. Word of Copper Ridge's peaceful resolution of what could have been a violent confrontation had spread throughout New Mexico territory and beyond, carried by merchants, travelers, and territorial officials who had witnessed the results of the community's moral transformation. Skybringer herself had grown into a remarkable toddler, whose development under the collaborative care of Sarah Mitchell, Chenoa Blackfeather, Dr. Hayes, and other community members was demonstrating the advantages of multicultural education and community-based child rearing. At 2 years old, she was already showing signs of the intelligence and adaptability that would characterize her entire life, speaking words in 3 languages and displaying an intuitive understanding of social dynamics that impressed adults who had known her since that desperate day when she had nearly died from community indifference. The child's daily routine reflected the collaborative approach that had emerged from her rescue, spending mornings with Sarah Mitchell, learning basic academic skills and European cultural traditions, afternoons with Chenoa Blackfeather, acquiring traditional Comanche knowledge about nature, survival, and spiritual practices, and evenings with various community members who contributed different aspects of her education, according to their particular skills and cultural backgrounds. This unconventional arrangement had produced a child whose intellectual development was already extraordinary by any measure. Dr. Hayes monitored Skybringer's health and development with the fascination of a medical professional who was witnessing something unprecedented in his experience. A child whose mixed heritage was being celebrated rather than hidden, whose multicultural education was producing cognitive advantages rather than the confusion that territorial authorities claimed was inevitable when children were exposed to multiple cultural systems simultaneously. His detailed documentation of her progress was contributing to medical literature that challenged prevailing assumptions about the effects of cultural diversity on child development. The child's presence in Copper Ridge continued to attract attention from territorial authorities, who remained suspicious of any community that openly defied conventional racial boundaries. But Captain Harrison's strategic reports had provided bureaucratic protection that allowed the arrangement to continue without official interference. The captain himself had become an unofficial advocate for peaceful resolution of conflicts involving indigenous peoples, using his military authority to prevent the kind of violent confrontations that had previously characterized territorial expansion in regions where different cultural groups competed for limited resources. Sarah Mitchell's adoption of Skybringer had been formalized through territorial legal procedures, but the child's daily life reflected the reality that she was being raised by an entire community rather than a single parent. Her education was already incorporating elements from Mexican, Comanche, and European traditions, creating a learning environment that honored all aspects of her heritage while preparing her for life in a world that was slowly becoming more accepting of cultural diversity through the influence of communities like Copper Ridge that had proven such acceptance was both possible and beneficial. The teacher's classroom had become a laboratory for educational approaches that other frontier schools were beginning to study and adapt, demonstrating that children learned more effectively when their education honored their complete cultural heritage, rather than forcing them to choose between different aspects of their identity. Students from families representing all three major cultural groups in Copper Ridge were showing academic progress that exceeded territorial averages, suggesting that multicultural education produced cognitive advantages rather than the confusion that segregationist policies claimed to prevent. Dr. Hayes had established the first medical practice in New Mexico Territory that officially served both civilian and indigenous populations, creating treatment protocols that combined European medical knowledge with traditional indigenous healing practices in ways that proved more effective than either approach would have been independently. His success in treating patients from different cultural backgrounds had attracted the attention of medical schools in the eastern United States, where his innovative approaches were beginning to influence training programs for frontier physicians who would work in culturally diverse environments. The collaboration between Dr. Hayes and Chenoa Blackfeather had produced medical breakthroughs that were being documented in professional journals and shared with other practitioners who worked in regions where cultural diversity created both challenges and opportunities for healing, approaches that transcended traditional boundaries between different systems of medical knowledge. Their joint research on treating children of mixed heritage was providing scientific evidence that cultural integration produced health benefits rather than the complications that territorial policy claimed to be preventing through segregation and cultural suppression. Thomas Reed's blacksmith shop had become an informal community center where people from different cultural backgrounds gathered to share news, resolve disputes, and collaborate on projects that required the kind of cooperation that transcended individual self-interest. The shop's central location and Reed's reputation for honest dealing made it a natural meeting place for discussions about community issues that affected everyone regardless of their ancestry or previous experiences with territorial law enforcement. The blacksmith's approach to his craft had evolved to incorporate techniques from all three cultural traditions represented in Copper Ridge, producing tools and household items that were more durable and functional than anything he had created, using purely European methods. His willingness to learn from indigenous and Mexican craftspeople had not only improved his work, but had also created economic relationships that strengthened the community's overall resilience and self-sufficiency. Father Miguel's church services had evolved to incorporate spiritual traditions from the three main cultural groups that comprised Copper Ridge's population, creating religious ceremonies that reflected the actual diversity of his congregation rather than imposing uniformity based on European Christian traditions alone. His innovative approach to ministry was attracting attention from Catholic authorities who were beginning to recognize that successful evangelization in frontier regions required flexibility and cultural sensitivity that went beyond simple translation of European religious practices. The priest's Sunday sermons now included references to moral lessons that could be found in traditional stories from all three cultural backgrounds, creating a spiritual environment that honored the religious insights of Mexican Catholicism, indigenous spiritual practices, and Protestant Christianity without requiring anyone to abandon their ancestral beliefs in order to participate in community religious life. This inclusive approach had produced a congregation that was both more diverse and more unified than any other religious community in the territory. Frank Morrison's general store had become a trading post where traditional indigenous principles of reciprocity operated alongside conventional monetary transactions. creating an economic system that was more resilient and sustainable than pure cash-based commerce. His inventory had expanded to include goods that served the needs of all cultural groups in the community, and his understanding of value had broadened to encompass social and spiritual considerations alongside financial profit. The store's success had attracted suppliers and customers from throughout the territory who were interested in participating in economic relationships that were based on mutual benefit rather than simple profit maximization. Morrison's business model was being studied by other merchants who had discovered that inclusive approaches to commerce could be more profitable in the long term than exclusionary practices that limited their potential customer base to single cultural groups. Eleanor Whitman's public acknowledgement of her debt to Chenoa had transformed her from a nervous politician's wife into a confident advocate for policies that protected vulnerable community members, regardless of their cultural background or social status. Her experience of being rescued by someone she had been taught to fear had given her moral authority that made her an effective spokesperson for inclusive approaches to community building that transcended the racial and cultural divisions that territorial policy was designed to maintain and enforce. The mayor's wife had become a regular correspondent with women's organizations throughout the territory, sharing strategies for building communities that could successfully integrate different cultural groups without the violence and chaos that territorial authorities claimed was inevitable when racial boundaries were not strictly maintained. Her letters provided practical guidance for other communities facing similar challenges, demonstrating that peaceful coexistence was not only possible, but actually produced stronger and more prosperous societies. Deputy Coleman's law enforcement philosophy had shifted toward community-based problem-solving that emphasized restoration over punishment, mediation over prosecution, and prevention over reaction. His jail remained mostly empty because disputes were increasingly resolved through processes that addressed underlying causes rather than just punishing symptoms, creating a model of justice that other communities were beginning to study and adapt for their own use. The deputy's success in maintaining order without relying primarily on force or imprisonment had attracted attention from territorial law enforcement officials who were discovering that communities with inclusive social policies required less policing than communities that maintained strict racial and cultural segregation. Coleman's reports to territorial authorities provided evidence that multicultural cooperation produced more stable and peaceful societies than segregationist approaches that created ongoing tensions and conflicts. The transformation of Copper Ridge from a community that had nearly allowed a baby to die from indifference into a model of multicultural cooperation had happened quickly, but the participants understood that maintaining their progress would require ongoing commitment from each generation to the principles they had discovered through crisis and moral testing. The lessons they had learned about the power of individual courage to catalyze collective change were being shared with other communities facing similar challenges throughout the expanding American frontier. Skybringer's rescue had become more than just a local success story. It had become proof that ordinary people possessed the capacity to choose love over fear, inclusion over exclusion, and moral courage over social convenience when circumstances demanded that they decide what kind of community they wanted to create and maintain. The baby who had almost died while 27 adults watched had become a living symbol of hope for anyone who wondered whether positive change was possible in a world that often seemed determined to punish difference rather than celebrate it. As the sun set over the cemetery where Mary Catherine Wells rested beneath flowers that bloomed year-round, Jake Coleman reflected on the lesson that 2 years of watching moral courage produce practical results had taught him about the difference between the world people claimed to want and the world they were actually willing to work to create. Through their daily choices and their responses to moments when those choices were tested by circumstances, that revealed their true priorities. The sound of a healthy 2-year-old's laughter drifted across the desert evening air from Sarah Mitchell's house, where Skybringer was playing with wooden toys that Thomas Reed had carved and painted by hand. That laughter had replaced the desperate crying that had once echoed through the cemetery. But Coleman remembered both sounds as reminders that the smallest and most vulnerable among us possessed the power to call forth either the best or the worst in the communities that determined their fate. Copper Ridge had chosen to answer that call with courage, and the consequences of that choice were still rippling outward, like stones thrown into still water, creating waves of positive change that would touch lives in ways that no one could fully predict or measure. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.